From Minnesota's northern forests to its southern farm fields, public schools are in trouble.
The state taking over education and saying that we're going to fund 100% of the general education revenue, and then not following through with what they said they were going to do, have forced districts to do operating referendums.
It was in 1858 that the Minnesota Constitution made it the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools and create a permanent school fund to finance those schools. About 20 years later, a law was established that initiated state aid for high schools maintaining a minimum course of study and a minimum school year. A few years after that, a state law was passed that allowed a property tax levy for support of schools, and in 1933 a state income tax was enacted that allowed proceeds to be distributed to school districts based on the number of resident children in the district aged 8 to 16. There have been many other laws added or changed over the course of Minnesota's public school history, and there have been challenging financial and curricular periods for school districts during Minnesota's long history of public education. Perhaps none more challenging than today. From Minnesota's northern forests to its southern farm fields, public schools are in trouble. My name is Ray Gildow, and this is a program that looks at some of the challenges facing public education in Minnesota today and solutions that some feel need to be implemented in order to move Minnesota public education into the 21st century. No one that we interviewed for this program thinks this is going to be easy or pain-free, but a growing number of experts believe that what is happening in our public schools and how we finance them is simply no longer good enough to prepare our young people for the future.
Well, schools right now are struggling somewhat for money for a couple of reasons. One being many schools are having stable or declining enrollments. Enrollments are declining because the demographics are working against school districts. We're finding more and more choice in the state, so people are sending their kids to a lot of different programs, homeschool, private school, charter schools, etc. So there's fewer kids in school, and the fewer kids then also means fewer dollars. Secondly, we're in an era where Minnesotans and their government believe that it's more important not to spend excess money, especially on education in some of these kind of areas, and to try to keep the taxes a little bit in check. As a consequence of that, schools have been struggling financially. Schools also have been struggling because they have not been as successful as private business in becoming more efficient at what they're doing. Now, schools have worked hard to become more efficient, but the reality is we haven't found any way to really break out of the roughly 30 kids sitting in a class with a teacher equation. So there isn't a lot that you can do to become more efficient in that kind of a setting. Given all of that, school districts, in their frustration about not having enough money coming from the state or from whatever the state formulas are, have been going out and asking their local citizens if they would be willing to vote for additional local property taxes to support schools. And to some degree that's been successful, but to some degree it's been unsuccessful. The two things that are happening right now is that as there's more pressure on local property taxes combined with a weak economy, the Joe average citizen is having a harder and harder time voting yes for a referendum for schools than they've had in the past. The second thing that's happening is that the battles on these referendums have heated up considerably. When I was a young superintendent, you'd ask your community to support a referendum there was a little bit of debate, maybe a few articles in a newspaper, and you had a vote. And it was usually successful, not always, but that was about all there was to the campaign. Now we're finding school districts where tens of thousands of dollars, pushing towards $100,000, are being spent on either side in these vicious political battles, the result of which is that it leaves the community with a bad taste about the schools. Even if they voted for the schools, they're kind of angry, and we've turned the schools into kind of a local political infighting kind of a contest. I see that as a very, very negative thing that's happened to our schools.
On the average, about 80% of the school district's operational budgets comes from the state, and about 5% comes from the federal government at this point in time. There have been some long-term trends in terms of school finance and the portion that comes from state aid. If you go way back in the history of funding before 1970 or so, the majority of the funding came from local property taxes. In the early 1970s, we had a major change in school finance, sometimes called the Minnesota Miracle, where the percentage of funding was increased to close to 70% state funding when you look just at the operational budget of the school districts. And it stayed fairly level at about that point until 2001, when the legislature did another major change in the state financing system for schools and increased the state share closer to 80%. And so we're really about the highest that we've ever been right now in terms of the state share of funding for K-12 education. When students open enroll in the state of Minnesota, the general education funding and the special education funding follows the student, so that the student that's serving the school district that's serving the student is going to receive the funding for that student. And that puts a stress on the school district where the student left, because they now have fewer students. That means they have less revenue. Also, because the state funding formula doesn't fully cover the cost of special education, it covers about 2/3 of the cost, and because the state makes the school district of residence, where the student lives, responsible for the unfunded costs, we have a system where the school district serving the student is billing back the resident school district for the unfunded cost, and we call that special education tuition billing. And so that gets to be an issue of contention sometimes between the resident school district and the serving school district, in terms of seeing those bills come in and needing to take dollars out of their general fund budget to cover the cost of those special education programs. Generally, school districts all receive the same basic education formula allowance. We currently pay $5,074 for every student enrolled in public schools. But the state does recognize that there are different characteristics of school districts and different characteristics of students that require different levels of funding to go to different school districts. One of the fundamental differences we make is we do grade level weighting of students. So we fund secondary students in high schools, at a higher rate than students in elementary schools, based on the theory that it costs more for high school programs than it does for elementary school programs.
Well, funding for schools, I think, is universally below where it needs to be. Across the board, there's just not enough money being put into education. That has resulted in some people saying the system is broken, and other people saying that it's not broken, we need to fund it the way adequately. Schools have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get by with less. The state taking over education and saying that we're going to fund 100% of the general education revenue, and then not following through with what they said they were going to do, have forced districts to do operating referendums. And all they did was shift the responsibility from the state level to the local level. So property taxes are going up because that's what supports operating referendums. Even though a vast majority of the districts have operating referendums in place, and property taxes are taking off and people are really pretty upset, there still isn't enough money to make the system work. If you compare it against the amount of inflation that's been put in place, there just isn't enough money there. So rural schools, schools, suburban schools, they're all suffering from a lack of funding. There are those who would say that, well, Minneapolis gets a lot more funding than Brainerd or another rural school district. In some cases, that's absolutely true. There's more money being pushed into certain school districts. Some of that is because of the characteristics of the districts. In some cases, sparsity aid comes to rural districts. All kids deserve to have an equal opportunity. That's really what education is about. Everybody gets a fair chance. And so if you can't help it, if you as a child live in a district that is sparsely populated and you have to ride a bus an hour and a half to get to school, when you get to school, you should get the same chance and the same opportunity as somebody who lives in Wayzata or Orono. And by the way, I grew up in Orono. I think those should be fair opportunities. That hasn't happened.
Well, the real problem with the referendum now is that it's become such a central part of education funding. You go back to the history of the referendum to the 1970s, really when they first started to show up. They were showing up in districts that were having major declines, and a lot of these districts were the high wealth districts, and they were trying to maintain programs in the midst of this really rapid decline. These were the Leave It to Beaver suburbs that Wally and Beaver were going off to college, and there weren't any kids left over, and they were needing to at least keep school districts afloat. You think of Hopkins and Edina and Bloomington closing schools, all the tough decisions that were being made, and they were passing referenda as part of that. Going back then into the late 70s, early 80s, less than half of the districts, even probably less than a third of the districts in the state had referenda. But as we've seen, there was an economic downturn in the late 1970s, early 1980s that caused problems. I think that's when more people started to head out for referenda because the state couldn't keep up with its commitment to education or funding education. Things got a little bit better again in the late 1980s, but again in the 90s early 1990s we saw another economic downturn. Student growth was helping some districts that were growing, but it was not allowing the state to put money on the basic formula. So you were seeing this real need for the referenda, and that's when we created the referendum equalization program that really opened up use of the referendum, or I shouldn't say opened up use, but it made it a much more usable tool for low property wealth districts, with the state participating in helping low property wealth districts, the taxpayers there, get more or get comparable money for their tax effort. At that time, I think there was just a great number of school districts that never ever thought about passing a referenda, started to pass referenda. And that's continued to this day, to where we now have 90% of the districts in the state have a referendum in place. The problem is that it's no longer paying for the extras, which the referendum used to pay for. When you think back to those school districts that were trying to maintain very high levels of program, now those districts are passing referenda to keep the doors open. And you're seeing that in many, many districts throughout the state, the referendum becomes a question as to class sizes from big to unmanageable as a result of a referendum not passing. You see in some instances where a referendum's not been renewed, you see districts really dismantling programs that have been there for a long, long time. I think that there's a legitimate place for voters to express their support for school districts through increased levies, but when those voters are asked to basically keep the school doors open by passing a referendum, I think that's the state has probably moved away from the commitment that it should maintain. Referendum should be there for extras. It should be there to do the fourth foreign language. It should be there to put the really hybrided science and math courses that a community may see as necessary or desirable for their students, but goes well beyond what an average student or even an above average student should expect out of a school district. That, I think, is the question where we're at right now, is that the referendum has become not something that deals with education at the margins, but really is central to education. And I don't think that, I just don't think that's good policy, because I think you're putting too many school district programs at risk based on one voter changing his or her mind. Going from yes to no can change a district dramatically, and we see that in the last year. We saw several districts. I believe Delano passed theirs by 4 votes, and I think if I had the list in front of me, you could find districts that failed by less than 50 votes, and less than 50 votes make a huge difference in what students will be getting this year. And you only have, whether it's 4th grade, 8th grade, or 11th grade, every student only gets that once. And so not having that continuity, not having that predictability to say I'm going to be in a chemistry class next year that I need for college, and to all of a sudden have a referendum not pass, and all of a sudden that chemistry class goes from every year to every other year, for instance, and a student says, what am I going to do? I don't have access to that chemistry class anymore.
We have just over 340 districts in the state, and the numbers that I understand go about like this. 200 of those districts have less than 1,000 kids, and only about 40 of those districts are actually flat or growing in terms of student enrollment. And schools are driven by student enrollment. Without, every kid's worth X number of $1,000, and so every kid that comes in the door is worth money. And those districts that are in severe decline, or even just creeping decline, have fewer dollars every year to use to run the place. Now, districts spend between 80 and 90 cents out of every dollar on salaries, wages, and benefits. I mean, they've got fixed costs. And in the smaller districts, it's between 85 to 90%. That's kind of a national number, but really there's very little entrepreneurial money in schools. There's no money that you can use to try something different, because so many of the dollars are locked up. The remaining dollars that aren't locked up in salaries and wages and benefits, in those negotiated agreements, the rest of those have state and federal and local strings on them, and you just can't do what you want. I mean, I've got a friend who's a soup in a district, I'm just trying to think here, probably 25, maybe 1,400 kids. And he said, I probably have less than $300,000 that I can literally do what needs to be done with. Everything else is earmarked and line itemed and already spent. That's too tight.
Each Minnesota school district has its own story of trying to cope with the current financial climate. Recent cuts and the reaction to those cuts are many.
The Orono Alliance for Education is a nonprofit educational foundation started by parents of students in the Orono School District in about 2000. And their initial premise was to enhance the education that was being offered at the schools, provide additional kinds of resources so that other things could be offered that weren't available at the time. It fairly quickly got changed because of the cuts in the state budget and the funding formulas. From that to retaining teaching positions. And so over the last 7 years, the Orono Alliance for Education has given to the schools approximately $275,000 a year, a little over $1.9 million, and preserved a little over 30 teaching positions. That has been pretty much the driver up and through this calendar year, this fiscal year, I should say. It is not what we want to be doing at the Alliance. It's what we have had to do because of the budget crunch that the state has laid out on the shoulders of the school boards and school administrations. The premise that we operate by is that there's a lack of vision when it comes to the importance of education. Not at the school level, not at the parent level, not at the administration level, but at the funding level.
I work in South Dakota, North Dakota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And I will tell you that I see unhappier boards in Minnesota and I see unhappier administrators. In some districts, some administrators have probably been through 6 or 7 bienniums of cutting. You know, a part of their job every spring is to start cutting. And every fall, they start the year with some different faces because some great people had to leave. That's painful. That's running a system in decline, managing a system in decline. That's not growing a system that's vital and essential. Couple that in with people not passing some local levies and all the consternation that goes about it, some of the negative campaign that's come out against levies, and you know, these school board jobs and school administration jobs are just tougher than hell. I went to a school board meeting in a district that shall remain nameless here recently, and one of the school board members said, you know, I live out by so-and-so, and every day there's a bus goes by with 2 kids on it. I mean, we're not spending our money, there's only 2 kids on the bus. There was a long pause. One of the board members said, see, you live at the end of the bus route. So the reason there's only 2 kids on the bus is because, see, they're either picking them up and they've only got 2, or they're dropping them off and there's only 2 left. Oh. You know, I think it's pretty easy to look at a governmental agency, a school district, you know, and say, man, I could run that place better. And I get a lot of school board members that come on as business owners, business managers, business leaders, and they really think they can come in and, you know, sharpen up the axe and really make stuff work. Man, if there was fat laying around, it's been cut. And when you cut 5 or 6 or 7 bienniums in a row, I got news for you. They're buying paper as cheaply as they can. They're not buying number 2 pencils. Kids are bringing number 2 pencils from home. It's really easy to look at a big organization, pull out 1 or 2 items and say, man, we could thin this thing down, or we're overstaffed with administration. Man, it's a big challenge. The people that are taking on school board work right now have really got a difficult job as a result of that.
My belief is that in time of scarce resources, which is a time we are presently in, and I think that if resources aren't scarce in the future, they're going to need to be used more diligently with greater care and greater focus than we've done in the past. But in time of scarcity, the way to increase resources is to come together in collaboration. And I believe that the state has to come together in that kind of an effort, and that we have to pull all of the entities in this state, the major entities that somehow impact the state budget, together along with the business sector in the state, and to begin to work our way through developing a vision for the entire state. A piece of that puzzle is education. Education over the, in the time frame that I've been a member of this state, which is now 9 years, it appears to me that the public educational system has simply been a political reflection, and that when the politicians wanted to change something, they changed something, and then it was implemented at the public schools. But it was done without what appears to be quantifiable research. It is done at the whim of the political wave, and it's not been done with overall foresight about what should be achieved. And so consequently, you know, we receive feedback and input that the public educational system is not achieving, even though we're doing better in our state than most states. And so all of those challenges are out there. My feeling is, let's understand what it is that we expect. Let's provide the funding to match that expectation. And then let's hold the systems accountable for delivery. And I'm not sure that all 3 pieces are presently in place, and that is a concern for me.
I think the first thing that you'll see, and I think this is very universal when they fail, is just a tremendous amount of dejection on the part of the people that were promoting the referendum. You'll see, I mean, these are, in many cases, these are people who have taken time off work or have worked in their worked evenings on vote yes committees, sometimes stay-at-home moms that are spending when their kids are in school, they're down at the, helping get the Vote Yes effort going and staying going. I just see a tremendous amount of a real what does it matter kind of thing, feeling coming out of these folks, is that they've really put their heart and soul into something, and something that's beyond themselves. It's something for their kids, it's something for their communities. And they see a real, I would say bitterness goes too far, but just a real sadness that they can't get that message across as to how important the education is to the community and to the state. I think that's the universal. Other than that, I think that you'll see from that point on, I think every community kind of tells its own story. You'll see some instances where, in places where they're successful, people coming in and saying to the school board, well, we're watching where every nickel goes from this point forward. And you'll see places where they lose. You'll see parents and the people that were voted against a referendum. You'll see that kind of, you'll see those types of confrontations. I think in other districts you'll see a real reluctance to come to the reality of what not passing a referendum means. There's several districts this year that I know in some cases they announced what the cuts were going to be. And now that the cuts are being made, folks are saying, hey, wait a minute here. We didn't agree to that. And they said, well, if you didn't vote for the referendum, you did agree to this. And some cases where they didn't publish cuts, and now people are saying, well, we would have voted for this. We'd have voted for the referendum had you told us we were going to have 40 kids in a science lab, or that we were going to be walking, kids were going to be walking further to the bus stop, those types of things. I think there gets to be, one of the problems with the referendum is that there's money, and then there's making that money operational, and there's two different sets of questions there. And there's always going to be people out there that say, schools are just inefficient. They should be able to do their business on half the money. And those people obviously haven't ever run a school.
The biggest challenge to changing our educational system is to getting all the stakeholders to understand that change is needed.
As a futurist, I have always been interested in the importance of education, because if you think about the role of education, it is by definition to prepare our children for the future. And one of the paradoxes we have these days is we have people who think if we just do it like we did with our grandparents or with our parents, if we go back to the way we used to do it, back to the basics, back to reading and writing and arithmetic, that if we do that, they'll be ready for the 21st century. Well, that would be like saying in the 19th century, if we teach our kids to really take care of the horses, and make sure they have really good penmanship for writing letters, that they'll be ready for automobiles and telephones in the 20th century. And so part of the game we have going today is the one team wants what they had when they were kids or what their parents had when they were kids because it worked for them. And we have another group of people, and I'm of this group, who are saying, no, the preparation for the 21st century is so fundamentally different than preparation for the 20th century that it is equivalent to a paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift is when you change the fundamental rules and regulations and the boundaries of your problem-solving mechanisms. Education is a problem-solving mechanism. It takes a child who doesn't know how to read, doesn't know how to write, doesn't know how to do mathematics, and puts that child inside a constrained set of boundaries, which we call the school. And then we teach that child a whole set of rules and regulations so that they can, in fact, think better, read better, write better, do all these things better, so that when they then graduate, they're ready to deal with the world around them.
We created schools around and designed them around teaching 100 and some years ago. If you don't believe that, think about the fact that every course in our high school tends to last the same length of time. Must have been an act of God that caused each. When I was in high school, it took as long to learn typing as it did physics. And we know why, because we schedule our teachers, and therefore we schedule the students in with the teachers. And not only does every course last the same length, but the assumption is that every student takes the same length of time. It's now possible to change that paradigm and to actually organize schools around learning. In other words, we then customize the learning experience for the individual students, and those that can move fast can go ahead and move through. And we know that students learn in different ways, and that would allow us then to create different ways of different learning approaches for different kinds of students. We believe that in there also is the potential for significant productivity improvements. We need teachers. We'll always need teachers. This would change the nature of teachers' work in dramatic ways. The technologies that are being developed today provide learning opportunities that nobody could have envisioned even 25 years ago. I taught science up in Wadena, Minnesota, and I remember trying to teach the eclipses of the moon and of the sun to my science room classes, and I would shut the lights off and use a basketball and a volleyball and a softball, and then try to shine lights to create you can go on the websites today and find a dozen different sites that'll show you lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, show you the solar system in ways that nobody could have done as a teacher back in the 60s when I was teaching. There are immense opportunities to dramatically change the way we do the school design and the learning activities. The dilemma we face is that it is almost impossible to get fundamental change in existing organizations, not just school, but private companies as well. Most of the major changes come from the creation of new organizations.
There are many differing views on why the current system of funding and operating our schools simply will not work for educating our children for the 21st century.
Public education is one of the major reasons that this country reached its level of dominance during the 20th century. There's just no question in my mind about that. The danger is that this country is trying to use an education system designed during the early part of the 20th century to meet our 21st century learning needs, and I don't think that's possible. I'm a firm believer in public education, but some of us have to be creative enough and determined enough to help it change in order for it to meet our escalating learning needs in the 21st century.
So, what's the difference between the world of the 20th century and the 21st century? Well, there are three things that I believe we should focus on. In fact, I helped a school get started in Chattanooga that tested this. And we called them the EFGs. And I said, okay, ABCs work great for the 20th century. You still need to read and write and you still need to do that stuff, but that's not the core anymore. The core is understanding our relationship to the natural world. That's ecological education, the E. Our relationship to being able to shape our own futures and how profound and important that is. That's the F, EF. And G is global education, which is understanding that the United States of America is not an isolated island in which there is no interaction with the rest of the world. In fact, it is completely the opposite. The United States of America, for all intents and purposes, is a conceptual empire. We influence the entire world. There is responsibility that comes with that as a citizen of the empire that is totally different than if you lived in New Zealand or Chile or Ethiopia or Pakistan. They don't influence the world like we do. So the new understanding in the 21st century is a deep and profound bioscientific education focused around how do humans interact thoughtfully and intelligently with the natural world around us so that we not only don't destroy it, which we've been doing by the way, out of ignorance really, not out of purposefulness. The fishermen who almost took the cod population to collapse in the North Atlantic didn't get up every day and say, let's go out and destroy our livelihood. But they didn't know how to think about it, okay? So ecological education teaches us how to operate in the world even though we are separate from nature. A lot of people say, oh no, we're part of nature. I don't believe that. I'm sitting in a chair. We've got a television camera here. We wear clothes. We look through the world with glasses. I got a electronic watch that's accurate to 1/30,000th of a second. Please show me another species who has any of these things, right? We are different, but we are of the world. And so it is our role as the most profound and powerful species to make sure we don't wreck the spaceship we are on. So ecological education teaches our kids how to think about and study and interact with the natural world. By the way, not just to not destroy it, we've actually got a replenishment role. We're actually going to have to get so good at interacting with the natural world that it heals from all the damages that we've done. The futures part of it, by the way, is tied to being able to think long term about complex issues, such as should we or should we not fish the cod as heavily as we've been fishing them the last 30 years. The long-term answer is you've got to reduce it now and you can fish some, but much fewer cod than you were taking before until the ocean has replenished the supply. And then from there on out, we fish intelligently so that we never diminish the population again. And I'm picking on the fish, but it's true with trees, it's true with prairie grasses, it's true with all sorts of living creatures that we have to get smarter about doing that. And the smart part is, first of all, we understand the ecological aspects of it, then we think about the future of it. So the second aspect in this curriculum is to teach kids, starting with a basic assumption, by the way, that you can and should shape your own future. That part of having free will and being a human being is that you have the capacity to actually make a difference in your future. It's not all strung out for you and you're just following a line, dancing like a puppet, that in fact you make choices every day that make a difference in your life. You can improve your life or you can hurt your life by those choices. And then the other aspect about future studies that I spend a lot of time on when I'm talking to kids is, what are the technologies, both hard technologies like cars and planes and things like that, but also the soft technologies like social structures and government. What are the inventions, the innovations in those areas that we're going to need in the 21st century for us to have a world where everybody is doing better every day without the planet doing worse?
Well, first of all, I'm hopeful that over the next couple of years that the Minnesota legislature, the Minnesota governor, and the Minnesota citizens, who ultimately are responsible, are going to decide that making a significantly larger investment in schools would be smart. And I also hope the schools are smart enough and their employees are smart enough to figure out how to use that money in ways that actually enhances the student's education. If we get more money and we simply burn it up, citizens are not long going to want to be supportive. You have to show ways that you can make things better. That's not always just by test scores. That's by just really having what citizens see as a good and caring school system. So that's my hope. And some people might think I'm a Pollyanna about that. Yet that's what we did in the early 70s when we first decided to have the state equalize education, and we had a succession of governors and legislators, Republican and Democrat, that invested heavily in education. And it worked well for Minnesota. We created a pretty darn well-educated populace. We got a lot of our kids going to school and to college, and we ultimately thrived. So the question is, will that same formula work again? Will making the investment allow the schools to do a really good job? Will the schools do a great job? And will we ultimately have a better trained workforce than our competition? The other thing that's very important to remember is that in 1970, our only competition were the workers on the factory lines in Detroit, our corresponding farms in Wisconsin and Iowa, and our retail businesses. Today, our competition is a global competition that we have to worry about. So that's a bigger, more complex environment for us.
Perhaps one of the biggest challenges to creating a new system of public education is to change the public's perception of its cost.
One of the ironies that we see in state and local funding is an assumption by a group of people that education is a cost of the society, instead of saying education is the single best investment that we can put into our society. So that the paradox is, do you invest in your house? Do you invest in your retirement? Sure we do. We want to put money away for that. We want to have that. Well, if you think about investing in education, it is investing in my retirement, your retirement. It is the safety net that we build through our children that will keep our society economically healthy, so that those of us, as we move into retirement, have a secure future. So when I hear people complain about the cost of education, you know, the old line is, what's the cost of not education? In fact, I believe in very strong terms, it's not, if we don't spend the money, we're in neutral. It's not spending enough money on education puts you in a negative situation. So it's not positive or neutral, it's positive or negative. And that gap is enormous in terms of what it does for the future. That gap will amplify the negative side of it, will amplify, and it will make it worse and worse every year that it goes on. So you want to be on the positive side. Better to have kids who are too well educated. Wouldn't that be horrible if our kids were too well educated?
There's a lack of vision when it comes to the importance of education. Not at the school level, not at the parent level, not at the administration level, but at the funding level. If we thought of, as a state or as a country, education being a strategic initiative instead of a budget balancing item, all sorts of great things could happen. But instead of that, instead of it being looked at as the new ethanol or a new biotech invention or a new medical device where we're willing to give tax relief incentives and all sorts of possible financial aid, we don't look at education as anything but a cost. Education's not a cost. Education is an investment. It's an investment in the kids. It's an investment in our communities. It's an investment in how important the United States will be ultimately as a competitive entity in the world.
Ireland is a wonderful example, by the way. 25 years ago, they were the bottom of the heap. And they said, we are going to invest in education, and we are going to give our kids a chance to get the best education possible, because it is an investment in our future. It's not a cost, it's an investment in our future. I just read last week that finally, after 25 years, and this is a paradox, by the way, but it's a paradox I wish we had, companies are beginning to pull out of Ireland. They're beginning to not bring more jobs to Ireland because the salaries are so high. The people are earning so much money that they're looking for a place to go cheaper. But think about a 25-year run where every year you added jobs, every year the salaries went up. At some point, of course you'll bump to a limit, which they did. But the point is, they understood the role of education and the importance of education and the value of education, therefore they put the money in.
Another challenge facing Minnesotans will be to attract the best possible talent in an educational environment that is proving to be less desirable than in years past.
I think the the conversational challenge of the constant put-downs of education has had a much greater effect. You know, teaching has always been a profession that has paid modestly but gave people pretty solid protection in their lives. And it's still that same profession. It pays modestly, and most people who are in education are relatively well protected in their jobs. But there was a time when you could be very proud to be a teacher. It was a respected profession in your community. Small farming towns to big cities. I am a teacher was an important thing, and your ego felt good about it. But since the 1980s, for the last 20 years, we have been constantly denigrating education and saying negative things. And even now I hear people talking about, oh, you know, the teachers aren't well trained, or it's the poorest people in teaching, et cetera, et cetera. That all in combination starts to push your most talented people away from teaching. You know, most people would be willing to work for a little less money in an honored profession. If it's a dishonored profession, smaller pay doesn't look very good, does it?
If we're going to change our educational system, the two most obvious questions that emerge are, what are some of the changes that need to be made, and where should the leadership come from to make those changes?
The referendum, the local referendum, is an aging dinosaur that, if not close to extinction, should be extinct in a relatively near future. And the reason is it puts our relationship of the past and the future in direct conflict. The superintendents who have to lead those efforts must begin to think about leaving the communities, because if they're not successful, there's still going to be an impact even if they are successful, and that impact frequently is going to be in negative relationships. So at some point, if they continuously have to go out, that relationship or trust begins to diminish simply because we have to ask. We're the only one in that public sector who has to ask for additional funds. And that dinosaur needs to be buried.
We know how the consumer price index is computed. The economists take a market basket of goods and services and price them year to year, so that we then can track what's happening to the price of those goods and services. Well, in that basket of goods and services are some companies that are making significant productivity improvements. And so if you add those in, and we do, that drives down the rate of inflation. Increased productivity drives down the rate of inflation. But then you use that, so we then come out with a CPI index, a consumer price index, inflation index for any given year, and we use that then to guide our decisions about funding other enterprises like education, which are labor intensive. Well, if you don't have productivity increases, you automatically have an inflation rate then that's significantly above the CPI, see? And I think that's what we're seeing in both higher ed and elementary secondary. In higher ed, it's resulting in significant scary rises in tuition. I'm afraid that in elementary secondary, it's quietly eating the system from the inside, because they don't have access to increased revenues like higher ed does. They're constantly squeezing out. We squeeze out services, and we squeeze more kids into the classes, and we're quietly, in my opinion, undermining some of the quality that we became accustomed to in the 20th century.
McKinsey did a study, which I think is really important, and Americans should take a look at this very carefully. They had been looking for a study that explained why Singapore and Finland and Canada and South Korea and some of these other very top-notch schools scored so well when the United States was way down the line. And they said, and by the way, the educators who went and did the study said, well, we can't figure it out. There doesn't seem to be any commonality. So McKinsey went out and they said, oh, there's commonality. There's no question. There's three things that all the very top countries are doing, okay? Number one, they are hiring from the top 20% of kids out of college to get their teachers. Not the bottom 20%, the top 20%. Well, our top 20% are lawyers and doctors and lawyers and accountants and lawyers, right? Okay, why is that? Because the money's there. Well, guess what? The reason they can hire from the top 20% is because they pay them really well. They say, hey, teachers are our future. It is through the teachers that we get the investment, that the money gets converted into the value in the student, right? You just can't hand the kids money and say, okay, we've set aside $9,000 for you, so here's your $9,000. That's, you're smarter now. You can read better now. There's this intermediate function called teaching that you have to have. So number one, hired from the top 20%. Number two, paid them really well and supported them really well. By the way, what comes along with high pay and high support is you also tend to say, you probably know what you should be doing. I probably don't have to tell you. So we don't have to create one national format for you all to follow, because I think you're probably smart enough. You will probably individualize for the students just because you're in the top 20% of your class and you are a great teacher. So a lot more flexibility there, right, with these kids scoring so high. And then the last piece, which I think is really important, is as soon as a child begins to show any drop-off, any loss, kind of falling behind, immediately there is help to bring that student back up to speed with the rest of the students. So that instead of, what do? We say, oh, gee, too bad you didn't make it, you're going to have to take the year over. Number one, by the way, that's a stupid expense. You know, a little bit of money spent between February and March with that kid might have kept that repeat from ever happening, you know, but that's not the way we do it. Well, that's what they do in the very best schools in the world.
I think it has to be some combination, but in my observation now in the last decade of working at the state level, governors are very, very important to this equation. To the point that a governor can be in tune with what the citizens want and can also create a working relationship with the legislature, even if they're different parties, but a working relationship, I think you can really move the ball. Shy of that, I think it's very, very difficult to move forward.
Most of my work from 1975 until about 5 years ago was focused on paradigm change. Paradigm change is when the fundamental rules change, so that the rules and the boundaries that you had yesterday about how to do something, they're gone. And now you've got this new set. And the reason that happens is because the old rules couldn't solve the new problems. It's all driven by problems. New paradigms don't show up unless you've got problems to drive them into reality. And so right now in education, I think we are in the midst of a paradigm shift. And the old paradigm shift was school is a social institution where sports dominate and kids learn okay, but it's really not important enough to put in the time that it really deserves. The new paradigm is sports is an encumbrance. It's getting in the way of the work of education. It will become, by the way, I think, a community-based thing. I think sports is wonderful. I just do not think it should be coupled with academics. So I believe the paradigm shift is going to separate out sports, put it over here and say, okay, if you want to do that, parents, you can write those checks. School district isn't writing those checks anymore, okay? We're going to take that money that we used to have for that and we're going to pour it into what's really important. And the end result is going to be, school's going to be 225 to 250 days long. It's going to start at 9 because you don't want to start any earlier than that because they can't learn anyway. By the way, our school in Chattanooga, because we were a new charter school, we couldn't get the buses to deliver our kids till 9. Best thing that ever happened, because they got to sleep late. They got to, go to the bus depot or the place at 8:30. They got there at 9. They were bright. They were awake. Didn't waste 2 hours pretending like from 7:30 to 9:30 was a good learning time. But anyway, so we'll see. School's going to start at 9. It's going to stop at 5. There will be no homework, because in the evening that's where you choose to play sports if you want. So your choice will be: do I want to watch television or do I want to play sports? Not do I want to watch television or do I want to do my homework? So the paradigm shift this country is going to have to go through is we're going to have a separation. We're going to have to cleave sports from school such that the hero at school is the calculus student, is the history honors student, is the lead tenor in the choir, not the quarterback of the football team. And I think until we do that, we are not going to be able to get as serious as we need to get to have our kids ready to compete and play in the 21st century. See, because the real game is the game that's developed by their academic learning, not by their sports.
Minnesota public education started in small rural schools similar to this one in Villard Township, located near Staples. I found it interesting that none of the experts that we interviewed for this program suggested that we get rid of our schools and replace them with the internet or some other form of technology or social structure. They all value the importance of school buildings and the role education has in each of our communities. And although they may not all agree on the next steps, there is general agreement that Minnesota public education is at a major crossroad, and it is time for new directions. And like the decisions we've made about public education in the past, the decisions we make today will impact all of us far into the future. I'm Ray Gildow.